We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
This is Johnny Bluestar, host of Inalienable and Free, Voice of the Coalition. I'm fortunate now to be working with Don Newsom. Don is the owner of BBS Radio and has been with me since my very beginning on BBS, helping me to oversee the production of all of these shows. In our last show, Trump and the Children, Don and I felt compelled to focus on the separation of the children from their parents at the border. We saw the difficult dilemma that arises when you wish to uphold sovereignty but are faced with a refugee crisis which compels compassion and understanding, but is also sometimes compounded with criminality like drug smuggling and human trafficking and other types of criminal elements that also wish to penetrate the border. We feel that the protection of the borders of any sovereign nation is a necessity. But how do you cope with the trauma and suffering of real refugees? You certainly don't want to forcibly take them away from their children and use their immense suffering as ways to leverage related immigration policy. The southern border of the United States is not the only border problem in the world, and there's an obvious polarization between those who wish to welcome the refugees in so many different countries and those whose solution is Spartan and indifferent, often based on a feeling of nationalistic and ethnic exceptionalism. Considering the reality of protecting borders, is there some kind of different paradigm that will help? As the problem of the separation of families grew to its vast proportion it now has, simultaneously there was an escalation of trade tensions. It appears a trade war is brewing between the United States, Canada, Mexico, its European allies, and China. In certain ways, the border problem and the trade problem have similar roots. 1. The inability of countries to distinguish between their obligation to protect their true sovereign identity and provide for their citizens accordingly, and the need to see the validity to exercise responsibility over events outside their country which demand their attention and responsiveness. In reality, no country is an island. No country stands alone. Refugees come in all sizes, and their efforts often end in chaos and pain. Yes, we want an end to this, but not in the wrong way. The answer is not capitulation to some kind of borderless world, engineered and controlled by a ruthless dictatorial central government, but rather to respond to a higher calling for a way of looking at other countries and governments with respect for their different identities and governments, but also with respect for their rights to prosperity and happiness. Trade wars, as we are experiencing now, is because of a polarizing psychology which emphasizes insulated and selfish competition and is the result of countries' short-sightedness in looking at the greater advantage of utilizing cooperative capitalism to maximize their collective prosperity. Our coming discussion will be basically to lay down a developing paradigm that could create better results economically for all countries and develop a better paradigm for protecting borders but also dealing with refugees. Granted, it is based on an entirely different paradigm, emphasizing prosperity instead of a scarcity psychology. Accordingly, we suggest the development of trade zones throughout the world where countries agree to proportionally develop and manufacture products depending on the resources, talent, and interests of the countries. Categories of trade, like for instance building and manufacturing of cars, need not be exclusively tied to one country, of course, but factors of proposed demand and capacity to manufacture would configure into the creation of these zones. The idea would be to create trading opportunities based on truly fair and balanced criteria. This would require a completely different psychology of commerce, where companies looked at each other a bit more in the spirit of joint ventures for the sake of mutual prosperity, rather than as objects for conquest and destruction in the typical win-lose scenarios. In order to effectuate less risk and more trust between trading partners, a certain amount of profit sharing could be formulated. Another part of the answer would be to have legal measures in place to prevent oligopoly and monopoly, which has only led to massive poverty, government corruption, and a reduction of the intellectual freedom to create things that work rather than to maintain antiquated and destructive technology. Part of the answer would be the development of what I would call border empowerment communities, often in the area where borders geographically exist, but if that's not possible, then in other areas. Border empowerment communities would be created through an international agency that would, with the agreement of sovereign nations of the world, permit the settlement of refugees in border empowerment communities throughout the world, but not necessarily in the adjacent country where refugees are seeking support. Sustainable communities can be built and maintained for years. Twin Oaks, which you are looking at now, has been around for 40 years and is an example of what is possible. Not to be focused on the specifics of any one intentional community, a border empowerment community would be an area where countries, corporations, and universities would in effect create villages designed to expeditiously educate refugees in the skills necessary to create and build self-reliant communities instead of tent cities. These zones would function to create resources where countries and corporations could pull existing talent in these zones and utilize them on a temporary or permanent basis, whether they were agriculture or factory workers, scientists, educators, artists, or media experts. Those who remained in the community could at some point, when ready, be moved to empowerment villages where they would be able to shape their own community at an entirely different location.